Hello everybody, I'm Slow Rider, this is my world, yes, conveniently stuck behind a big lorry or two. I will be taking this CBR500R up for an MOT. It's been a year since it got put back on the road, a year since its last MOT. So it's got to be done, and I've got to nip some fuel first because I've not even got enough to get to the MOT station. And I've got about 45 minutes to get there and then get up to said MOT station. That's going to be a little bit tight for time. So it's going to be motorway after the petrol station. Hey ho, there's only a few petrol stations I actually like using at the minute. So, you know. Anyway, detracting from the point entirely because this video is nothing to do with the MOT or getting there or any of that. This is literally just an introduction for a video on something I needed to do to get this bike ready for its MOT. Changing brake pads. I didn't really have to change the front brake pads, they probably would have done, but they were starting to get a little low, I thought, so change them now, don't have to do it later, don't have to be told they're a little low. And I definitely had to change the I definitely had to change the back pads because, well, there's basically nothing left. So this is the video of me doing that and trying to be instructional as well, how I do it, and I think this is how it should be done. Worth noting though, this doesn't just apply to the CBR500R. I know it applies to the NC750 as well because they have the same calipers, the same brake pads, so the same process will apply to that, and there might be other bikes that are similar as well. People would pay attention. The main differences with the NC750 are that I think the actual disc itself is bigger, so the positioning is slightly different, and I know the exhaust is in a slightly different place for the back calipers, so bear that in mind, but basically the same process applies. So first things we have to do is loosen the slide pin. You can take the slide pin out at this point if you really want to, but I thought it was just to loosen it. Loosen it would be the best option. After that, we will need to loosen and remove the two bolts which hold the caliper to the suspension arm. The tool I've got here is a full torque wrench. It's probably a bit overkill for doing this, but is what I had to hand at the time. Very quickly they'll be easy enough to unscrew by hand, as I've done here. And once those bolts are removed, it should be nice and easy to move the caliper off of the brake disc. If you have already moved the slide pin, the actual brake pads, the used ones, might fall out at this point. If you haven't removed the slide pin, this would be the best time now to do it, because you've loosened the bolt. It should just be a case then of twisting the slide pin until the thread is out and then gradually removing the pin. You may need to apply some pressure to the brake pads in order to remove the slide pin fully, because there is a spring in the caliper which pushes the brake pads against that slide pin. with slide pin out, the brake pads will fall out. Don't forget to clean off the slide pin before you put it back in. The next thing to do is to clean out the caliper area. There's lots of brake dust that builds up, and brake cleaner should be sufficient to get rid of most of that, but always wise to give it a wipe out as well, just to try and get rid of as much of the dirt and grime as possible. The next thing you need to do is actually push the pistons, the piston pots I should say, out a little bit so that you can clean them properly. With this having two pistons at the front, it'll only push one out initially, so you need to brace that to get the other piston pushed out. And to do that, I put the old brake pads on each side of the caliper and use a G-clamp to hold it in position. I use the brake pads here purely as a way of not damaging the caliper and the piston pots. It's then possible to get in and clean the piston pots, which is nice, again with the brake cleaner. It's important to remove as much dirt as possible from here because you don't want any dirt build up getting behind the seals in the brake pistons. That would be a very bad thing to happen. Fortunately with this particular pad there wasn't much dirt on the pistons to clear off. With that done, the next job is to push the pistons back, the piston pots rather, back into the pistons. Again done with the G-clamp and with the two old brake pads. Gradually twisting the G-clamp to squeeze the piston pots back inside. Now I have heard some people say that you need to open up the brake reservoir by the handlebar. I didn't have to. They push back in. I don't see any reason why you should have to. With the piston pots pushed back in, this is a good chance to test fit the new brake pads. Make sure you can put them in properly and they sit in the right place. If they don't, maybe give it another clean out or try and work out why they're not fitting properly. In my particular case here, they fitted quite nicely. It is important, I understand, to grease the back of the brake pads, the metal side. Don't actually do the pads themselves, just the metal side of it. And whilst you're at it, you might want to grease up the slide pin as well so that it can be reinserted. And then the new brake pads can be put in. This is the point where you slide the slide pin back into position. Again, you may need to apply some force to the brake pad. I'm not very good at this bit. But yes, because the brake pads push against the pin, you may need to apply some pressure to them. And then the final part of the slide pad again will just twist into position with the threads that are there. You can get the slide pin relatively tightly fitted at this point, but you can always check it again later. Once that's in place, you should be able to separate the brake disc sufficiently, sorry, the brake pads sufficiently to get them over the brake disc, which means you can start putting the brake caliper back on the bike. It should fit quite easily, and then the two bolts, the two securing bolts, can go back in to hold the caliper against the suspension arm. Initially you can twist these in, they'll probably go about halfway, turned by hand, and then you'll need to use a ratchet or torque wrench to finish off the job to tighten them up. It's probably a good time to check that the slide pin is fully inserted and tightened up. One last thing to do before you go out for a ride is to squeeze the brake lever. This will push the brake pads onto the brake pad so that you actually have some brake force when you go out for the ride. Moving to the rear, we can see that the slide pin is behind the exhaust. It's basically the same as on the front, but it is a slightly different design. There's not a lot of room back here, so you might need a smaller ratchet or similar to actually get the slide pin out. I believe you can use a spanner for this, but it might take a little bit longer. This one you can either remove completely at this point or just loosen it. It's not going to make a huge amount of difference. You will have to remove it eventually anyway. With the slide pin loosened or removed, you can then remove one bolt here, the rear wood bolt holding the caliper to the bike. It's not necessary to do the front bolt, but if you did want to take the whole thing off, it would either mean taking the wheel out or taking the exhaust off, possibly. It's really not necessary. Again, as with the bolts on the front, it's a torque wrench or ratchet to loosen, and then you should be able to remove it by hand. This will allow the caliper to pivot upwards for access to the brake pads. It's at this point that I removed the slide pin, but as I say, you could have done that before removing the other bolt. It doesn't make a lot of difference. With the slide pin removed, releasing the caliper from the brake disc will just allow the brake pads to fall away. As with the front brake disc, this is a good time to clean the caliper area. Again, I use brake cleaner for this, but I have heard that WD-40 works well. I wouldn't really trust WD-40 around many areas of the bike, but that might just be me. Also, as with the front brake, you need to clear out the piston. There's only one piston pot here, so you don't need to worry about bracing it. Once you've cleaned out the piston pot, you then have to push the piston back as far as possible to allow the new room for the new brake pads. Again, the same as on the front brake pad, but you've only got the one piston pot to push back. And again, I use a G-clamp for this. You can then shift the caliper over slightly to allow enough room for the new brake pads to go in. Just moving the camera here so you can see where the brake pads actually rest. This was just a test fitting again to make sure they fit in properly. before you again apply grease to the back of the brake pads, ready for them to be fitted in their final position. As with the front pad, it's now time to refit the slide pin. Remember to clean it off and then grease it before putting it in. Again, you may need to apply some pressure to the brake pad to actually get them to fit over the slide pin. But again, it should be fairly easy to do that, and then you can just tighten it up with a small ratchet, as I'm doing here. You should then be able to push the retaining bolt back into place. It should turn by hand quite easily for quite a way, and then tighten up with a ratchet or torque wrench. There is just about enough room to do this with the exhaust where it is, but it is a bit tight. It may be worth just giving that slide pin just one more check that it's fully in place at this point. As with the front brake, there's one last thing to do, which is to push the rear brake until you get resistance. This is quite important because, again, if you go out for a ride and you haven't done this, you won't have any brakes. That's not good. Anyway, that's it. That's all done. Thank you very much for watching. Until the next video, be good humans. Ta-ta for now.